There is no disconnect between life and science. Life informs the science that we do, and science explains the mystery and wonders of life. We continue on our journey with another seminar, another great interview in this series of Confluence. We continue to explain how life and science meets and how they continue to inform each other. Welcome to another episode, the 6th episode of Confluence, where life and science meet.
Welcome, everybody, and I'd like for you to help me welcome Dr. Meg Lowen. Dr. Lowen is with us today from North Carolina State University, where she's a research professor, and she's also director of the Nature Research Center at North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Dr. Lowen has been nicknamed the real-life Lorax by the National Geographic and Einstein of the Treetops by Wall Street Journal. For the last 30 years, Dr. Lowen has studied the science of the canopy. And this has been a new territory. Scientists within the last couple of decades have really started looking up into the canopy to see what biodiversity exists there. And it turns out that Dr. Lowen fell in love with the canopy, has spent many hours, weeks, months in the canopy, and she has worked to map the canopy for biodiversity and to champion forest conservation. Dr. Lowen has traveled the world getting her education, and she has studied in places such as Williams College in Massachusetts, Aberdeen University in Scotland, and also in Sydney University in Australia. She also holds a degree in executive management and has really done much in educating people, both in academia and in the general public, on biodiversity. Interestingly enough, she was approached years ago in 1995 by Yale University Press to write a book for the general public about biodiversity, and this ended up on the New York Times, the cover of the New York Times Book Review. So, Dr. Lowen, tell me, you have such an interesting background, and I know you come from a very small town in upstate New York. How is it that you got interested in science in general and in the canopy and looking up as opposed to just looking around you?
First of all, my parents still wonder where I came from. Maybe the milkman. They have no clue. My mother has a pile of my publications. They have never been read. There's dust on them, but they're very proud of me, but they're just, no one in my family was a scientist. So it is kind of a strange thing. Sometimes you wonder how passion might well up within you or something. But my best possible reason is that it was a very small town without any kinds of activities. There were no malls or movie theaters, and of course I'm so old we didn't have internet, and so I played in the backyard with my one or two friends that tolerated me for being such a geek to study nature. Our world was outdoors, and I think that fostered a lot of love for nature, a lot of ability to see the four seasons and really think hard about how our health might relate to the natural world. So it really became a passion for me, a lifestyle, everything I guess I do and breathe and think has to do with conservation of the natural world. And boring.
So, well, I find it fascinating personally, so I must be one of those nerds as well. But how is it that, so you grew up loving this, and we often have hobbies growing up. So how is it that you made the transition into an area that is so difficult, because it's difficult to reach the canopy, and also I imagine there weren't too many women hanging out with you up there.
I don't think so, or men for that reason, but it is funny, and I guess I mentioned to some of the students making tree forts as a kid and having one friend who shared that passion with me, and how her brother was busy making bell-bottom jeans in his basement. His name was Tommy Hilfiger, and he became a clothing designer, and I became a canopy researcher. So something about what you do in your childhood might link to some synapse up here, maybe where you just resonate later on. And so when I decided, oh my gosh, I'd never been anywhere outside of upstate New York or never seen any forests except deciduous temperate forests. I suddenly got panic-stricken and saved up all my pennies to do a master's in Scotland and then a PhD in Australia, through scholarships, I might add. But that whole episode led me to see these trees in other countries and realize, oh my gosh, they're green all the time, especially in the tropics. And so I just thought it would be really cool to see why they're green all the time. How long do the leaves live? What's going on? And just fascinated me that we never went up a tree. We always walked on the forest floor. So it was purely a simple curiosity from a very small town kid, nothing sophisticated about the questions I asked, but it just turned out they were what we call a big black box. Nobody had gone there, nobody had done it. And you are so right, nobody was up there. So I was pretty much by myself. I learned to climb.
You had a lot of thinking time.
I did. The caving club at Sydney University taught me to climb. They thought I was a hoot because they climb down. They love their,
their
caves and their darkness, and they're like, what's this girl doing climbing up? They thought I was just hilarious, but they were very kind and helped me make a slingshot, and I sewed my first harness with a industrial sewing machine that they used for their caving harnesses. So there weren't any companies in Australia like REI or LLB, and there was no supplier of mountaineering gear, so I had to kind of make it up.
So were you an inventor as a child?
I think so, but again, very small town, nothing was sophisticated. We didn't even have a little shop in my dad's basement or anything, so my inventions were more like popsicle boats floating on the creek, or maybe a little tiny bed for an injured bird in our tree fort, nothing too sophisticated. But I suppose it made me also think about using nature to answer questions. So maybe in some ways, studying the canopy is all about solutions to understanding the health of the planet in some way.
Right. And it sounds like you needed to come up with some very creative solutions, because if you were among the first to go up into the canopy, how did you get up so high?
Slingshot. I'm really good with a slingshot.
That's very impressive.
And I will say that won me the respect of all my fellow graduate students in Australia, all of whom were male except me. I was the only girl in the School of Biological Sciences at the time, and the head of the department was so kind, and he came up to me and looked in my eyes and said, "Why are you doing this? You'll just get married and have children. It's such a waste of your time." And I was dumbstruck and tongue-tied. I was pretty shy, so I just thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? But in some way it might have made me determined. And when I got the rope thing figured out, I started teaching other people to climb. I actually had one team of Earthwatch volunteers, which was a great organization that provided me with human power to help with my research in Australia, but one lady got stuck in the tree.
Oh, no.
We had to pass her some scissors, and she had to cut the right rope, and it was pretty nerve-wracking. But that's what inspired me to think maybe we need another invention, and it led to the development of these canopy walkways, which are like paths through the treetops, and much safer for people who aren't so athletic, and easier for groups of people to work together. And that's become quite a global tool, including a lot of ecotourist operations.
Right, it really has. It's very.
I wished I'd patented it. I
Right.
could be retired.
Or saving lots of rainforests.
That's right.
So you mentioned that, I know you mentioned the warning that your advisor gave you, but you did indeed get married, and you did indeed have children.
I did.
And you still pursued. How did you balance family and work? And you were a single mom to boot at some point.
Right. So I ended up studying a huge tree outbreak in Australia called the eucalyptus dieback. It was a multi-billion-dollar issue in the country where all the eucalypts were dying in the 80s. Today, we would immediately say it was climate change. It was hot and dry for a decade, and a lot of beetles had outbreaks and thrived with those conditions, but nobody really knew what it was all about. So to solve that problem, I moved to the rural outback. And as my girlfriends say, the only eligible bachelor within 1,000 square kilometers was a sheep and cattle rancher that I married. And I thought this was great. I had my whole thousands of acres of dead trees to study for a lifetime or so, I thought, except the culture didn't allow me to do that. I was really the laughingstock of their family because women don't do that. Women cook and sew and have the babies. And so I couldn't fight a whole culture. My family was 10,000 miles away. So I really absorbed that until finally I realized it was going to impact my 2 little boys because they would grow up with different values. And so that's why I became a single mom by choice, in a sense. I was just thrilled to embrace the American culture where women could work without guilt. Not always, but at least there was some opportunity. And I became a college professor, and I think that's a really friendly environment for kids for the most part. It wasn't always. I think it was changing in the 90s when I returned to the States, but I think the good thing, or bad thing, you should interview my boys later, was they had to go to work with mom a lot more than any other kids because I couldn't leave them home alone. So they got their harnesses when they were age 4 and 5.
Oh, wow.
And they were specially made because they're so little. And I closed my eyes the first time they climbed. My brother took them to the top of a tree in Belize. It was about 90 feet. I'm like, please, just tell me when you're up there. But they did, of course. Kids are better than adults, aren't they, when it comes to that kind of stuff?
And they weren't afraid?
No.
They were thrilled?
They kept, oh my gosh, they wanted to go higher and more, and I'm like, no, we're going back down to eat. And, you know, the funny thing was we had tarantulas over our beds in these little huts in Belize, all sorts of things that were probably more dangerous than having these tree climb exercises, but that was the thing that made me a little nervous.
Yeah, it's a long way down, 90 feet.
We always had a joke, would I leave the boys at the bottom of the tree with the poisonous snakes or let them climb with mom? So I guess the answer was the latter.
Go up. Go up with mom. So you've actually worked in interesting places, in a variety of places. I know you were in Florida for about 17 years, is that right? And one of the places that you worked here for many years was New College, which is a very small, independent, free-thinking space with I think it has about 650 students, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely small.
Yeah.
So different from here. And of course, New College prides itself as the liberal arts honors college for the state of Florida system. It is small, so small that if I took a sabbatical, there would be no more ecology. In a sense, there is that sort of shortcoming to a small place, but the good part is that most of my students got to the Amazon with me. Almost all of them did a field ecology project out at Mayaca River State Park. We had a canopy walkway that I had built there in the park, and so we had quite an unusual opportunity for most of them to work side by side with their faculty advisor, and that was a pretty neat thing.
That is very nice. And you've established some really nice relationships here in Miami and throughout the state. That you've managed to keep up.
Absolutely, and Florida is my second home and maybe my real home because my boys went all through public school here in Florida, and that was such a good experience, I think, for all of us, that in some ways when they want to come home to vacation after college or something, they always choose Florida as their destination. So there's a lot of amazing things to study in Florida, too. We still don't understand most of the canopies of Florida forests. And there are, of course, all sorts of invasives now. And that adds a whole layer of challenge to the ecology of Florida that I think other states don't always have, for better or for worse.
Right. No, it's true. It's true, for better and for worse, for both. Earlier we were talking, and in your seminar you said you had this eureka moment where things sort of all fell into place for you. Could you describe that to us?
Sure, and I think sometimes those happen in mid-career. Some people have a breakdown, other ones maybe have a switch of pathways, which I kind of did. I'd been doing a lot of dedicated technical research on canopy health and biodiversity, which was great, and I published a lot of papers in journals that are recommended for technical reasons by the academic pathway. And when I did publish that book called Life in the Treetops, it amazed me that it got that book review and that it suddenly propelled the book into a bestseller list and into the eye of the public. And all of a sudden I had housewives around the country and builders of malls and students writing me and saying me, oh my gosh, if I cut down a tree, what will happen? Or how can I promote biodiversity in my yard? And what I realized was that one review had taken my message of science public, and it made me realize that probably we should do that more often, because we miss the public a lot of times with these technical publications. And even though we might need them as the building blocks of the science, we really need to prioritize reaching the public. So now I try to devote half my time to public outreach and half to technical research, because I think there's a big benefit to getting policymakers educated, and citizens need to give the messages, and we need to tell them what the truth is.
Right. And so when you're out there talking to the public, what do you have a few messages that are crystallized in your mind that you like to share? Or does that change with time, with the setting?
A little bit. I think with young people, it's really important to always have a positive message. The world of forest conservation is really depressing. I've had adults ask me what kind of antidepressant I take, because everything I study is being destroyed, and it looks really awful, the scenario. But so I think for kids you need a positive message, but I think for adults too. And so the one thing that I always try to remind people is that we're in charge. We can turn this around. The biggest cause of deforestation is American consumerism. What we buy here, and we buy it in huge quantities. And if we look at the timber and make sure that it's sustainably grown, if we buy shade-grown coffee instead of coffee grown in plantations, if we check out our beef and soybeans and make sure it doesn't come from Brazil, we will contribute to the sustainability of forests. So there are a lot of easy ways we can do good things. And I think everybody would like to contribute. I don't think anybody purposefully says, I'm going to go to Walmart and try to destroy the rainforest with my shopping. We don't have really good labels on products, and we need to ask for that when we don't have really good shopping habits, just because we're not educated.
Right. So we really need to get the word out there.
Right.
So I'd like to go ahead and open our questions up to our student audience and see if they have any questions for us.
What do you think your greatest accomplishment has been?
Wow, what a great question. My greatest accomplishment in science is probably to lead to the discovery that over half of the biodiversity on the land portion of the planet lives in the tops of trees. And that was simply a fate discovery by climbing and hearing all of this activity at the top and then starting to document it. Sometimes I call it the salad bar in the sky, because over half of these things are insects and they're all eating leaves, so it's a real hot spot for that. But if maybe somebody wants to write something on my tombstone someday, I would hope it might be science educator. I think reaching out to young people and trying to inspire them to become scientists and create solutions in the next generation is, I think, my most important role that I feel really good about. So I'm hopeful that my books and my time at the museum component of my job will lead to giving kids that might not have ever thought they could do science a chance to think, yes, I can.
So I just asked the question? Okay. So going on the same subject about the museum, what do you think is the key in order to make young adults interested in pursuing a degree in science? So what aspects of the museum do you have that really attracts their attention and their interest?
Right, cool question. So this new museum model that we perhaps are the first in the world to start in North Carolina asks the question, how do we know what we know? Most museums are, what do we know? Meaning they show you a glass case of bird skins or snakes and you count them or you know what color they are. So it's all about what. And this new museum concept is how do we know it, meaning getting kids immersed in the process of doing science, of very hands-on. So hopefully that might make a difference and make it more meaningful and more fun. So every kid that comes to the museum can come in a lab and do an experiment. A lot of the exhibits have touch tables where they can do something like maybe they're modeling what happens to the little things that live in the stream when the water gets more polluted. They can also meet the scientists. All of our staff scientists have to have 20% of their time in the public eye, meaning they talk to kids, they tell them how they became a scientist, what kind of clothing they wear, what they do on the weekends. One of them's a unicyclist, the other one does a lot of yoga, one of them's a trampoline expert. I mean, we laugh, but we think that by telling their hobbies, they become more human. And amazing to think, but the museum is what technically is called informal science education. And in America right now, most people agree that formal science education is failing. The system is not working and we're falling behind globally in terms of our competitiveness. So the informal world, meaning after school, on weekends, online, is thriving. And so they predict that jobs in the museum world will double in the next 10 years. So it's a good career track for students. It's a good thing to think creatively about how we can make a science message a little different. One example that I think I shared earlier was to teach kids about biodiversity. They can't all go to the Amazon and watch birds or climb a tree with me, but we did this belly button biodiversity survey where we analyzed the belly button biodiversity of all the teens that came in the museum, and everyone, almost everyone has a belly button. Maybe one or two people have had surgery. And they can all understand, because there were thousands of species we discovered live as microbes in people's belly buttons. And then students could see how we averaged it, how we mapped it, how they differed from their friend, and maybe how many showers they took. Did they have a dog or a cat in their house? See, there's all kinds of science woven into something like that. So if we can keep thinking of creative things. Now we're doing armpit biodiversity, by the way. So if you want to come up and see what's living in your armpit, could be fun. So again, different ways of trying to promote a science message instead of the textbook.
I have a question.
Okay, what do you aspire for? Like, what's your goals like now, from now on?
What is my goal? Oh my gosh, you sound like my mother. I love it.
No,
Thank you
because-
for asking.
Okay.
Do you want to say anything more?
I was just gonna say, because you accomplished so much, like some people, they just accept what they have right now, but then you still are trying to move and reach out to kids and stuff. So what are you trying to do?
I think the biggest goal for me, and again, it might reflect the fact that I came from a really small town where almost all my school friends are still in my hometown. They never left, and that's kind of a blessing in its own way, but in some senses I've become a connection for them to the rest of the world. And because I have, by chance, seen a lot of places like Ethiopia and India, I recognize there's a huge world, but it's all connected. And so I think for the next generation to understand that solutions have to be global as well as local, it's really important. And so, for example, taking a little bit of technology like Google Earth and sharing it with people in Ethiopia that never had access to that technology is now helping them understand how their forests are disappearing so they can save their forests. And so I think for those of us lucky enough to be educated in the States or in most developed countries, we can take a little bit of our talent and put it to work somewhere else where they're less fortunate, and then the whole world will be a better place. So my goals specifically are to save the forests of Ethiopia, help the women in India have equality when it comes to science education. And I guess it sounds a little schmaltzy, but again, I'm just a small town kid. I really hope the world will be healthy for my kids. I hate to think of them growing up and being restricted in terms of fresh air or fresh water, or maybe that they would never see the Amazon. So that's my hope, that we can figure out really great ways to keep the planet healthy.
Since you mentioned the technology part, your generation, like back then, you didn't have as much technology, right? Like, so my question is, do you think it has bad negative effects or positive effects? Especially like since our generation, we're just so. But actually, can I repeat that? Because I'm like stumbling a lot. Okay, so.
Say it again.
Okay, so since you mentioned technology, do you think it has a positive effect or negative effects, especially when you're trying to reach out to people our age, and some of them are more occupied on Facebook or Twitter and all that than actual forest?
I think as I look at my field of professional people my age, I think most people think that a lot of this technology has a negative effect. I always hear people complain that kids are seeing a tree virtually. They never see a tree outside in nature anymore. And a lot of that actually has come from parents that don't let their kids play outdoors. So there's kind of a little cause and effect that it's not necessarily the kid's fault. But I think what I'm trying to spin in my job at the museum is the fact that there's no way we could prevent young people from using technology. We couldn't close down Facebook, take cell phones away from everyone under the age of 30. You know, there would be a giant revolution. So rather than fight it, if we can turn those into tools that really work well. One young person that I've been mentoring actually started a volunteer program in San Francisco where they use cell phones as volunteer time. So instead of going to the Red Cross, you can translate letters from language to language, or you can take Excel and put data in while you're standing at the subway. So in other words, those same technologies that might appear to have a negative impact can have a lot of positive impact. So if we can balance that out, I think it's the solution in the end. And definitely ecology can have a negative impact as well. A lot of my generation were what people call tree huggers. I don't know if you ever heard that term, meaning they rejected technology and they wanted to be out in nature, but a lot of politicians resent that. They feel scared of environmentalists as a result of that generation. So we have to get people to be warming up to appreciate nature and the environment, but not be threatened that we have to preserve it exactly the way it is, because we can't, whether we like it or not. There's a lot of people on this planet. We have to balance human quality of life with natural ecosystems. It's not easy, but that's what you guys are going to do, your solutions.
So in many ways, you've been able to open the door for many young people to follow their dreams. How would you recommend that they be able to do it for others themselves?
Right, what a great question. I think, first of all, giving people a chance to think about what they're passionate for is really important. And sometimes that comes to you when you're taking a walk in the woods. Other times it comes from a class or maybe a great teacher or even a mentor, maybe a weekend experience somewhere. So thinking about what you love is really important, and sharing that and helping young people have the time and the joy of enjoying things that they love is really important. And I think secondly, trying hard to share what we have. It's really one thing I find when I work internationally is if we share our stories, bad and good. I mentioned to some of you today that I call my book my misadventures. A lot of bad things happened to me, but I think by sharing those stories about what it was like to be a woman in those very old-fashioned days when women didn't do science might help other women juggle career and family better, and even help men at the same thing. So I think by being open and transparent and always recognizing that we want to respect each other's differences but really appreciate them seems to be the best thing. One of my other passions is helping underserved people get into science, because I feel I was really underserved. Nobody mentored me. I didn't have a museum near my home, and I didn't really have anybody that told me I should be a scientist. Quite the contrary. So I think by always helping everybody equally, it's really important.
Brian. Okay, you say you want to save the Ethiopian forest and other forests. can you restore the other percentages, or are you going to try to maintain the 5%, less than 5% there is?
Right. Wow, that's a heavy-duty question, but a really good one. So here's a country where they have 5% left of their forests in northern Ethiopia. Unfortunately, the agriculture is so subsistence that we could never expect them to redistribute forests over a large part of the land, or people would starve. So the most important thing is we have to respect what the people need for their own health. So at this point, I would be really happy if we can keep the existing forests that are surrounding the churchyards, because the people love that, the priests love that, and that has all the biodiversity inheritance of the country. Whatever used to live out in those fields is gone, unfortunately, but those little green dots on the landscape have all the remaining birds and insect populations and native plants. And so if we can keep those, it's sort of like a genetic library for Ethiopia. And it's also the freshwater springs and the honey and the pollinators of their own crops. So my feeling is we should be realistic and try to stick with that. A lot of people say to me, oh, you have to connect all the forests. It would be really important. But that's only possible in a country as wealthy as America. So for now, I have to have a more realistic feeling about what's possible.
Yeah, but it is, like, do you think it's possible?
I think someday it's possible. My hope and dream for Ethiopia is that there'll be more agricultural advances. If they could get better agricultural practices, then they wouldn't have to farm as much to get a crop yield to support their families. And so I do think it's possible.
Other questions? Yeah, you have another one, Hannah?
I know, I'm thinking. Brian, do I have any questions?
We could do the closing segment.
Yeah, I was just giving you an opportunity. So you've mentioned in your responses that you've traveled, you do a lot of work in Ethiopia, you've done some work recently in India, and many other countries. Which of those projects, I'm sure they all have held a special place in your heart and in your mind at that time, but would there be one or two of these projects that are really very meaningful to you, or the ones that you're focusing, what are you focusing on more now?
Right. Wow. Well, I'm focusing urgently on Ethiopia because the forests will be gone in 10 years if we don't do something. And it's having a good success. So I'm feeling really thrilled. This last trip looks like we have 25 forests being fenced by the villages
Wonderful.
and the priests. So that's really heartwarming. If I have to pick my ultimate favorite place, it would be the Amazon, the upper Amazon in Peru, where I have a long-term research site. And partly because every summer I take about 25 people, all sorts of people, big and small and old and young. I call it citizen science, but it's really life-changing. If you said to me, I had to buy a one-way ticket for somewhere on the planet, I would buy it to go to the Amazon in Peru. It's so peaceful, it's so amazing to sleep with birds singing and jaguars calling and cool bugs in the treetops. It's just a very, very amazing, life-changing experience. And the joy that I've had sharing that with students it's making me choke. So it's just a really, really special thing. And if I had one wish for all of your students, it would be go there in the next 5 years. Paris will be there, London will be there. People travel to these places that won't disappear, but the Amazon is, and yet it's so extraordinary, and it just touches your soul. And I think it's such a gift, and it's been a real blessing to make friends with people there, to be part of a village community, which I now am, and have their trust, and in return try to work with them to keep that kind of community pristine. So put it on your list.
It is on my list, high on my list. So if in closing now, if you wanted to make sort of a final statement or a final wish, or just something that you would like to get across to our students and students and people in general, students and non-students in general, what would you share with them?
I would say take some risks. You know, people, it's funny, I never thought of myself as a risk taker, but when I look back, the fact that I bought this ticket on People's Express airline and flew to Sydney for $250 as a one-way ticket with 2 suitcases for 3 years, I think I must have been a lunatic. But, you know, I thought if I flunked, so be it, I'll come home again. So take a few risks, and I think also know that fate is a huge determinant of your career. I always looked around at my professors and smart people and thought, my gosh, they must have been so strategic. They knew exactly what they were doing at every turn. And as I look back, I think the best things that happened to me were sort of by accident or simply because I was in a little knot and I had to untie it. And in the end, it became a good thing. So I think in some senses, taking risks and trusting to fate are probably really good tools to have in your toolkit as an adult. And it doesn't hurt to be curious and want to explore a little bit.
That is a wonderful message. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowen, for being with us, for sharing your insights and sharing your story. Thank you. Oh, you
go.
Okay.
Why not? Have some fun.
Yeah, because we can put it in.
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of times you are the only female working. What inspired you to actually take up the role or apply as a man, like in your case?
Oh my gosh, what inspired me to work? You know, I can't say it because I was this gregarious person that wanted a date. I always think about all of these popular girls in my high school class, which I was not one of. But I think I was really passionate about the actual work, about making these discoveries in the canopy, trying to sort of tease apart the mysteries of the canopy. And the only other people doing it were all men. And so it made me think that I should do it because I had the skills to do it, and I shouldn't stay home just because there were no other girls in attendance. Funny, that happened a lot of times that in these camps or trips with all men, they actually kind of needed me. A lot of times with village relationships in remote places, they trusted the woman more than the men. Sometimes I would pull out a few pictures of my children and it immediately created a sense of trust in the village. And so there's an advantage to being a woman in a field situation. But I think a lot of me was just plain naive. I didn't really understand that I was breaking a glass ceiling. I just was pretty curious about my work. And as soon as I had figured more of that out and recognized that women weren't welcome, it also inspired me to think about trying to get more women involved in tropical biology.
So did they discriminate, like the men?
I think it was a man's world. People didn't think women could do it. But hopefully now that's changing. And there are certain rough things about it. And I would never want to trade having my children and spending time at home with them and doing things like that. But similarly, I wouldn't want to trade taking them out in the field. And the funniest thing is when I used to bring the kids sometimes and the men would go poo-poo, they thought that was pretty ridiculous. A couple years later, a lot of them would call me up and say, I really want to take my kids into the rainforest. How did you do it? What should I pack? You know, so in other words, I think it became maybe a bigger part of our culture as scientists to share our career with our families, regardless of your gender. So that's a good outcome.
Yeah, that was great. Do you guys have more questions?
No, sir.
Okay, now we can do
Bravo! It's a wrap. It's a wrap. What do they do?